In the summertime and, the spring, summer, and even if it's particularly mild autumn, I have a particular morning ritual at Padmavajra. Over the last few years at Padmavajra, our gardener has grown lots and lots of French marigolds, you know, those little tiny marigolds, oxblood red, orange, saffron yellow, pale yellow. He grows roses, lovely red roses, and every morning, early in the morning, I go and gather orange marigolds of different colours and red rose petals, and I offer them to my shrine, having cleared away the flowers of the day before. I offer candles and I offer very sweet incense, and I do prostrations to my shrine, which has images of my teacher, of the Buddha, of the lineage. This is a very important ritual for me. I love performing this ritual. The flowers in particular, especially the marigolds and the rose petals, have all kinds of associations for me. First of all, they just give me just great pleasure. I never fail to delight in and relish these flowers, especially the marigolds. And yes, the red rose petals. There's an intense delight in them for me. But they've also got very particular associations for me, because these flowers remind me so much of India, because these flowers are the kind of puja flowers par excellence, really, in India. And I have all sorts of associations of when I was first in India in particular, when Bhante came out and gave wonderful, great, big public lectures. I'd never seen this before, and he would be given so many flower garlands, and most of the flower garlands were made of these marigolds and roses, and also tuberose, sweet-smelling tuberose. And my job after the lectures was to gather up the garlands and get them back into the car and take them back to the place where we were living at the time and adorn the house with these garlands. The place would be scented and lovely. It reminds me too, these flowers, of the Gandhakuti, the perfumed chamber, the place of the flower offerings. The Gandhakuti being the place where the Buddha used to stay at Shravasti. In fact, wherever the Buddha stayed, according to early traditions, was known as the Gandhakuti. In fact, it's even said in some commentaries that the Buddha is always dwelling in the Gandhakuti. His state, his spiritual state, his transcendental state, is that of the perfume chamber, the abode of flowers. The origins, what we're getting here to, of course, is the origins of puja. The origins of puja, you know, are strongly aesthetic and deeply human. Puja really arises out of the courtesies of human life. Puja arises out of, if you may remember Bhante talking about this, out of the way in which in Indian culture, people treat the honoured, the unexpected guest. I was very deeply impressed living in India by Indian culture, particularly the culture of courtesies to the guest. Sometimes I go to the homes of very poor, illiterate people you would think would be uncultured, but their culture was in the way they treated me as a guest, the way they would treat any guest. They were far more cultured than me. I felt like an oaf very often going into these sometimes very, very poor dwellings, and I realised I was in a highly developed culture. The courtesies that would be extended to me, to sit in the best place, to be handed a single rose and a glass of water, and then of course eventually tea being made. I remember one of my most wonderful aesthetic experience happened in a very, very poor slum in, it was next to the biggest, a slum next to the biggest slum in Asia in Bombay. I'd gone to this place, and it was so poor, this family. It was the family of a couple of mitras in our Sangha, by an open sewer, dingy light in the evening. And I went there, and again I was greeted so beautifully. And the widowed mother of the house made tea, and she brought me the tea, and I drank the tea, and I was lifted into another dimension, because so unexpectedly, so amazingly, the tea was scented with roses. And this was so unexpected in this hovel, really. I was completely transported. It was one of these ecstatic moments. And I said, "This tea is wonderful." And the lady of the house smiled and said, "Yes, it is wonderful," all in Marathi, of course. Wonderful moment. So puja arises from the way people would have naturally treated the Buddha, the human Buddha. It arises naturally out of the way in which people would have treated their elders. The way people would have naturally treated the Buddha would have been with reverence and courtesy. They'd want to please him in the most ordinary human way, through beautifying the environment, through offering. And this brings us on to puja as practice. Puja goes on, we go on treating the Buddha as the honoured guest, the unexpected guest, the greatly desired guest, long after he's gone. And that brings the Buddha closer to us. Bhante, of course, has made the connection for us between puja and aesthetics. He gave an early lecture called Poetry and Devotion in the Spiritual Life, the Sevenfold Puja. And there's, of course, a book on that subject, Poetry and Devotion in the Spiritual Life. So I'm getting into some very old and familiar ground in getting into this material. It's so easy to forget how important this material is. Certainly important for me. Puja is incredibly important for me, and it's why it's a practice that I go back to again and again, because it was through puja that I decided that I was a Buddhist. The first night I went along to the classes that Buddhadasa was taking in a house in Brighton, long before the Brighton Buddhist Centre. Well, actually not that long before, in fact. But the first night I went along, Buddhadasa taught a full-length Metabhavana and then led a sevenfold puja. By the time I came to the mantras in the puja, I knew that I was going to be an order member. I'd only met an order member 20 minutes or an hour before or something like that. I knew that I was going to devote my life to Buddhism. I can't tell you how I knew, but I knew. It's very, very weird. In that old lecture of Bhante's on poetry and devotion, he speaks of the puja as a sequence of 7 devotional moods. 7 devotional moods. Through reciting the verses, through reciting the poetry, we evoke a mood. Even through reciting the poetry, dwell in that mood for a while. And the word mood has started to acquire a particular significance for me. I don't think I really paid very much attention to this word mood until a few years ago, and my thinking about it, or my feeling about it, because I realised I don't do a lot of thinking. I think I do a lot of feeling. Anyway. But my thinking about it was provoked by reading in Bengali bhakti traditions of various kinds, particularly, sorry to say this, but it just sounds great, particularly what's known as the Vaishnava Sahajias, a rather obscure kind of combination of Krishna bhakti tradition and tantric material. And some of their treatments of to do with mood arises out of Indian aesthetics, Indian aesthetic theory. So in reading this material, I went back to reading Bhante's ungiven lecture, which is in The Priceless Jewel, which I've reread a number of times, called Literary Criticism East and West. And in that lecture, he tells us something about Indian aesthetics. Now, everybody will be pleased to hear that I am not even going to attempt to talk about Indian aesthetics. I've read what Bhante said about it. I had a quick look when his non-Buddhist library was open at some stuff, but I'm really just not going to go there. But what I appreciated in reading in this Vaishnava Sahajya text was its description of a particular ritual, a particular sadhana, a particular meditation. Pretty wacky stuff. But what they talk about is that this sadhana is about inhabiting, invoking a whole sequence of bhavas, moods or emotions, bhavas, which then lead you to rasa, the direct tasting, the essence of what the particular sadhana is about. Yes, you inhabit the bhavas, the moods, the emotions, to reach the rasa, the direct tasting. Rasa meaning taste, flavour, but also juice and essence and sap. I gather from reading Bhante's essay, in his little discussion of Indian aesthetics, that the one who appreciates the work of art is called the rasika, the one who tastes. This is Bhante now. The one who tastes, that is, the one who appreciates or enjoys the unique and indescribable flavour of a work of art. Yes, the rasika is the one who tastes, that is, the one who appreciates or enjoys the unique and indescribable flavour of a work of art. Bhante then glosses the rasika as the one of aesthetic experience. So why is this language of mood and taste, bhava and rasa, so important for me? Not knowing really very much about it, but what has it sort of evoked in me? I think it actually might be helping me to understand my Dharma life, my life. A few years ago, when I was going through a particular crisis, Bhante looked at me quite directly when I was telling him my sort of tortured, conflicted stuff that was going on. He just looked at me and said, "You are a very emotional person." He didn't say that was a good thing or a bad thing. He just said, "You are a very emotional person." Now the thing is, I don't remember anybody ever saying that to me so directly. Maybe they had, maybe some of you here said it to me loads of times and I couldn't hear it. But the fact is, he said it. You are a very emotional person. And of course, if someone you revere and love and respect more than anybody else tells you you are a very emotional person, you need to take it very seriously. So I started to notice just how emotional my responses are. I mean, just to absolutely everything. And by the way, I just want to go down on record. I sometimes just want to get this off my chest, because people often come up to me and say, the thing I like about you, Padmavajra, is you're so passionate. I can tell you, I hate it. I hate being passionate. I really, it's in many ways, it's a real curse. I really would like to be more equanimous. I really would like to be more thoughtful and more reflective. It's not a good thing to be, passionate. So don't tell me that's why you really like me.
But you are.
It'd be very, very nice if somebody said to me, Padmavajra, what I really like about you is you have so much equanimity and you're so thoughtful. But yes, it's always an emotional response, be it in meditation, Dharma study, just about everything, communication. I've realised as well it's all about, the emotions are always sort of, they're not necessarily intense. Often they do seem like kind of changing moods that I sort of pass through, in a meditation, noticing this sort of flow of moods. And I like this sort of metaphor of flavours, the sort of flavours, or even better perhaps perfumes, or even colours, the sort of even tinctures. I can sort of notice this sort of flow of, or weather even, that sort of goes on. Yes, my responses are very emotional. In literary criticism, East and West, as well as the Western part of that, Bhante refers to the literary critic John Middleton Murray. And I have read some John Middleton Murray years ago, his book Keats and Shakespeare, which I really loved that book. I read and reread that book. And Bhante quotes a passage where John Middleton Murray, in a letter to Catherine Mansfield, who I think they were married at one time, John Middleton Murray describes himself as an absolutely emotional critic. An absolutely emotional critic. He said, I know I'm not so good on the sort of technical aspect of things. Actually, he's a very fine intellect indeed. But he said what happens when he reads a work, it affects him emotionally first of all. He sits up, that's the word he used. He sits up when there's this emotional encounter with the work. And then he works out why. Then he works out why it's having that effect. Now I found that very helpful when I read that. I'm nowhere nothing like the genius of obviously of John Middleton Murray. I offer this in humility, but I am strongly emotionally led. I sit up when the Dharma, when a particular aspect of the Dharma is presented to me, well, in a way that touches my emotions, when anything affects me emotionally. Only then can my mind begin to work. If there's no emotional connection, I can't get my mind working. I can try, but it just doesn't really get going. There has to be the juice of the emotional response. And this is one of the reasons why Bhante is my teacher. He has made the Dharma emotionally alive for me. He's made life emotionally alive for me. Yes, there is the wonderful clarity, and I would be nowhere without the clarity. But as Bhante has made the Dharma emotionally alive for me. For me, he is a poet, an artist of the Dharma. In so many ways, he's able to evoke the living force, the living emotional quality of the Dharma. I was saying to the men on the course the other day how I feel my introduction to the Buddha comes from Bhante. When I, listening to Bhante evoke the Buddha on a seminar or in talks, I really get a sense of what it would have been like actually being with the Buddha. There's an emotional charge to, how he evokes the Buddha. In so many ways he's done this for us, certainly for me. But even with the whole area of meditative states, dhyana, Bhante's spoken about dhyana in ways that has sort of evoked dhyana for me that no analytical presentation can do. I'm not saying that the analytical presentation isn't important and even necessary. I don't think Bhante would reject that at all. But very important for me is Bhante's evocations of the 4 rupa dhyanas. Don't you, if you remember them in that old Brighton lecture, A Method of Personal Development, he goes through the analysis, he goes through the Buddha's similes, and then he says, in plain English, as he says, based on reflection and to some extent experience, he just evokes the dhyanas. You remember integration, inspiration, penetration, and radiation. Is it penetration? Permeation. And tucked away in a seminar, I think the Dhyana for Beginners seminar, he goes even further. He talks about the dhyanas almost as archetypes. He talks about the first dhyana as the human, the second dhyana as the artistic or the prophetic, the third dhyana as the mystic, the mystical, and the fourth dhyana as the magical, the state of the magician. And sometimes having all of this, absorbed all this material, just maybe a few phrases, a few words from these descriptions, when I've become concentrated, more absorbed in meditation, I just turn to a fragment of that evocation and in a way start to feel, if not dhyana, the presence, the mood of dhyana happening. The poetry of it, if you like, evokes the mood. And being called to those states, the way he's talked about them is so expressive, so evocative. I realised recently, looking through one of the attractions to the Sufis, when you really get into some of the really deep Sufi literature, their descriptions of the stages of the path are so poetic, so expressive. For example, they talk about the whole movement in meditative experience, in spiritual extraction practice, and they evoke this through beautiful metaphors. I won't try to talk about those metaphors. For example, the oscillation between states of expansion and contraction of consciousness as a sort of necessary movement within consciousness, ecstasy and sobriety. And yes, they use wonderful poetic imagery to evoke these moods. Also with Bhante, I just had a look before this talk. I was going to sort of bring it in, but I don't think I will. I had a look at his fragments from a meditation journal that he kept when he was on a retreat. It's in a section called Nature Cure Clinic in the Sign of the Golden Wheel, and just a few words he has to describe his experiences in meditation are so evocative, so poetic. Which brings me back to the puja. Recently, I've been helping people who've been having difficulty with puja to connect with it a bit more. And on one occasion, I sort of taught it as a meditation. We went through the stages of the puja, but before each section, I just say a few words to evoke the mood of the stage of the puja. So we dwelt in the mood and then recited the particular verses associated with it. And in doing this, I realised much more fully than ever how profound our humble sevenfold puja really is. I could sort of glimpse, as I was sort of dwelling in these states a little bit, these moods, well, how I could really begin to see how, if you really dwelt in these moods, really went through them, well, you really would start to become a fitting vessel for the arising of the bodhicitta, which of course our sevenfold puja is for. It's a practice to raise up the bodhicitta amongst us. And our puja all begins with beauty. It begins with beauty. It begins with offering up, with skill and care and love, the most beautiful and lovely things that we can create physically, imaginatively. We're offering them up out of our immediate, beautiful sense experience to the embodiments of the highest, inconceivable beauty. In Shantideva's original text, which our puja is derived from, the worship section is lavish. It's so lavish with that wonderful Indian bhakti mood. It even includes bathing the Buddhas and clothing them in well-dyed, beautifully dyed garments, sweetly perfumed and praising them with hymns of praise. Sometimes people think this is all a bit much, all a bit over the top, and I'm reminded of Bante's friend who, when Bante told this friend that people had complained about the purple passages, the embroidered passages in the Survey of Buddhism, and his friend said, "That which you love, you adorn. That which you love, you adorn." No need to mention, I think, to you all the different moods of the puja. They all culminate in self-surrender. They all culminate in the entry into service, into sevaka, into selfless service. That's where it all emerges. In this stage of the puja, we can surrender the painful burden. We can feel ourselves to be. The Buddha has a little sutta called The Burden. How painful the 5 skandhas can be, what a burden they are, dragging them around. Of course, and now I'm addressing I'm still dealing with the issue of craving, and now I'm coming to craving for non-existence. Sometimes we feel that we can deal with the burden, the heavy weight that we carry, by trying for non-existence somehow. Of course, that's impossible. You can't get to non-existence. You think you can, but you can't. Actually, the best way to give up the burden is to offer it up in puja, and in the end in selfless service for others. A friend of mine recently was really feeling the burden of his existence, feeling very, very low and depressed indeed, couldn't meditate, couldn't really engage in his Dharma work and so on. Was really feeling quite low and came to see me about it. And I said, what I'd like you to do every day for a week is the 7-fold puja, and then report back to me and I'll give you the next teaching. And because he has a certain amount of confidence in me, he did it. And he found it enormously beneficial, and he's carried on doing it. And of course it's opening out into other things. So that little humble 7-fold puja really can do something. The moods, the bhavas, these complex bhavas, lead on perhaps to the rasa, the direct tasting, the juice, the essence. They lead to the bodhicitta, to the qualities embodied in the mantras of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas with their particular indefinable flavours. And perhaps, dare one say, on into the essence of the essence, into the silence, into the indefinable taste of shanti, shanti, shanti.